Welcome, wherever you are right now, lying down, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Know that you are in a safe and gentle place. Tonight, we are going to take a quiet journey together, a slow, unhurried exploration of one of the most fascinating mysteries that science has ever encountered. We are going to talk about a molecule, a tiny, extraordinary molecule that exists inside the very fabric of life on this planet, inside plants, inside animals, and, in some form, inside you. Its name is DMT, and though that name might sound clinical or complicated, the story behind it is anything but. It is a story of consciousness, of wonder, of ancient traditions and modern science slowly reaching toward the same quiet questions. So allow yourself to settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, and simply listen as we begin at the very beginning. DMT stands for N N-Dimethyltryptamine, and you do not need to remember that name. What matters is not the chemistry of its letters, but the simple, almost poetic fact of what it is. DMT is a naturally occurring compound. That means it is not invented. It is not artificial. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, in hundreds of plant species across the planet, in certain grasses and bark, in seeds, in tree roots, and most remarkably of all, it has been found in trace amounts within the tissues of the human brain itself. Chemically, it belongs to a family called tryptamines, and that family is one you are already deeply familiar with, even if you do not know it. Because serotonin, the molecule most associated with feelings of well-being and peace, is also a tryptamine, and melatonin, the chemical your brain produces right now as you drift toward sleep, is a tryptamine too. DMT is a quiet cousin of sleep itself, a quiet cousin of peace itself. Scientists have been studying DMT for decades, and yet it remains in many ways deeply mysterious. We know it exists. We know where it is found. We can measure it, synthesize it, hold it in a laboratory. And yet the deeper question, why does it exist at all, particularly within the human body, remains beautifully, frustratingly unanswered. Some researchers believe it may be involved in the mechanics of dreaming. Others believe it plays some role in the extraordinary experiences people sometimes report near the threshold of death. Some think it may be part of the brain's own inner pharmacy, produced at certain moments of deep meditation or extreme stress or profound transition. But these are still theories, still possibilities, not certainties. And that uncertainty, rather than being unsettling, is, in its own way, one of the most beautiful things about this molecule. It reminds us that the human mind is still, even now, full of rooms we have not yet opened. To understand what DMT does, we need to take a very brief, very gentle look at how the brain works. And do not worry, we are not going anywhere complicated. We are simply going to pause for a moment at the surface of things, the way you might pause at the edge of a calm lake and look down into the water. The brain is, at its most essential, a communication system. Billions of tiny cells called neurons speak to each other constantly, passing messages back and forth through chemical signals called neurotransmitters. These chemicals bind to specific receiving points on the surfaces of cells, like keys fitting into locks. And depending on which key arrives and which lock it opens, the brain's experience of reality shifts in one direction or another. Serotonin is one of those keys, and it has a particular lock it prefers, a receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. When serotonin reaches this receptor in the ordinary way, it produces feelings of contentment, of connection, of gentle clarity. DMT, because it is chemically so similar to serotonin, can fit into that same lock. But when it does, the effect is something far more profound. When DMT binds to the 5-HT2A receptor, particularly in large amounts, the brain's ordinary patterns begin to dissolve. The usual boundaries between different regions of the brain, the invisible walls that keep one kind of processing separate from another, begin to soften. Networks that rarely speak to each other suddenly begin to communicate. The brain becomes, in the language of neuroscience, more interconnected, more fluid, more open. Scientists sometimes describe this as a state of increased neural entropy. Entropy in physics simply means a kind of productive disorder, a loosening of rigid structure, and in the brain, under the influence of DMT, this loosening appears to create something extraordinary, a state of consciousness that is simultaneously more chaotic and more unified than ordinary waking life. Imagine the brain as a city at night. Usually the streets are quiet, traffic moves in predictable patterns, each neighborhood stays within its own borders. But under DMT, it is as if every light in the city comes on at once, as if every road connects to every other road, as if the whole city becomes, briefly, one living, breathing, luminous thing. Beyond the brain, the body also responds to DMT in ways that scientists are still working to understand fully. The heart rate may change, blood pressure may shift. The autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that governs breathing, digestion, and the deep rhythms of the body, appears to be involved in some way. Many people who have encountered DMT in research settings describe a physical sensation that precedes the deeper experience, a kind of vibration or warmth that moves through the body. Some describe it as a feeling of acceleration, as if the body were moving very quickly through space while remaining perfectly still. Others describe it simply as a wave, long and warm and irresistible, that carries them forward without effort. And then, gradually or suddenly, the ordinary sense of where the body ends and the rest of the world begins to change. The boundary between self and space becomes permeable. The body remains, but the awareness that usually inhabits it seems to expand outward or inward, or in some direction for which we do not yet have a name. One of the remarkable features of DMT, from a purely scientific standpoint, is how brief its effects are when encountered in isolated form. Unlike many other substances that affect consciousness, which can last for hours or even days, the full effects of DMT, when encountered in research settings, often last only 15 to 30 minutes. And yet, within those few minutes, the experiences people report are almost universally described as among the most profound of their entire lives, more vivid than dreams, more real, many say, than waking life itself. The neuroscientist and author Rick Strassman, who conducted the first government-approved study of DMT in human subjects in the 1990s, described the experiences his participants reported as occupying an entirely different category from any other altered state of consciousness he was aware of. The brevity and the depth, the smallness of the molecule and the vastness of the experience, these contrasts are part of what make DMT such a persistent object of fascination for scientists and philosophers alike. Now we come to something that science can describe but cannot fully explain: the lived experience of DMT. What people actually encounter when this small molecule opens the doors of the brain wide enough for something entirely different to come through. We should note before we go further that the overwhelming majority of what we know about the DMT experience comes from accounts given by research participants, people who encountered the substance in carefully controlled laboratory settings, with medical supervision and with time afterward to reflect on and describe what they went through. These accounts are subjective, they are personal. They cannot be measured or replicated in the way that a chemical reaction can be measured and replicated. And yet across cultures, across centuries, across people who have never met or spoken or read each other's words, the accounts share certain themes so consistently that scientists cannot quite explain the similarity away. And it is those shared themes that we will sit with now very gently in the quiet of this evening. The first thing many people encounter in the early moments of a DMT experience is geometry. Not geometry in the dry mathematical sense of the word, not angles and equations, but geometry as something alive, as something radiant and endlessly complex and somehow meaningful. Patterns begin to form in the visual field. They emerge as if from behind the ordinary fabric of things, as if they were always there, just beneath the surface, and the DMT has simply made them visible. Mandalas, fractals, tessellations of impossible intricacy, shapes that fold into themselves and then unfold again into new shapes, cycling endlessly through transformations that should not be possible. These patterns are often described as more vivid than anything in ordinary visual experience, more saturated in color, more precise in their detail. They carry a quality that people struggle to articulate, a kind of intentionality, as if they have been made by someone, as if they are trying to say something. And the colors that people describe in DMT experiences exist, many say, outside the normal range of human vision. Colors that seem to vibrate, or to carry an emotional charge, or to be somehow alive in a way that colors in ordinary life simply are not. Some researchers have pointed to the similarities between these reported geometric visions and the art of ancient cultures around the world. The spirals carved into stones at Newgrange in Ireland, the geometric patterns woven into textiles across South America, the intricate symmetrical designs found in religious art from virtually every major civilization in human history. Whether these connections are meaningful or coincidental remains an open question, but it is a striking one. Others have noted the similarity between DMT visuals and the phosphine patterns produced by direct stimulation of the brain's visual cortex, the simple geometric forms that appear when the visual system is activated without any external input. It may be that what DMT does, in part, is amplify and elaborate these natural patterns until they become the overwhelming geometry that so many people report. Beyond the geometry, many people describe a sense of entering a space, a vast, luminous, impossible space, quite different from any room or landscape in the ordinary world, but experienced with the same unquestionable sense of being there. This space is often described as feeling more real than real life, more vivid, more present. Not like a dream, because dreams, we know even while we are in them, have a certain fragility, a certain transparency. The DMT space, by contrast, is described as completely solid, as having a kind of density and coherence that makes ordinary waking life, by comparison, feel like the dream. The architecture of this space, when people try to describe it, often defies ordinary physical logic. There may be structures that appear to be both inside and outside simultaneously, dimensions that seem to add to the usual three, a quality of light that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere, a sense of depth that appears to be literally infinite. And then, in many accounts, though not all, there are the entities. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the DMT experience to speak about without reaching for language that sounds either too clinical or too mystical, and so we will simply try to describe what people report as honestly and as gently as possible. Many people who encounter high doses of DMT describe the presence of other beings in the space they enter, not human beings, not recognizable animals or creatures from mythology, something else entirely. Beings that seem to exist in that space naturally, as if they have always been there, as if they are at home there in a way that the visitor is not. These entities take many forms across different accounts. Some people describe them as tall and luminous, made of something between light and geometry, not quite solid in any conventional sense. Others describe them as small and quick and intensely curious, moving around the person with an energy that feels playful or urgent or deeply compassionate. Some describe them as faceless presences that nonetheless communicate a profound and specific feeling of love or of knowledge or of welcome. A striking number of people describe the entities as being engaged in some kind of activity when encountered, as if they were already busy with something before the human arrived and then turned their attention toward the visitor with interest or amusement or care. Some describe being shown things, objects, patterns, information that felt enormously important in the moment but proved difficult or impossible to bring back into ordinary language. Some describe receiving messages, not in spoken words but in a kind of direct knowing, information that arrived fully formed without the usual process of hearing or reading or being told, a transmission, a download, a gift. Rick Strassman, in his clinical studies, documented hundreds of such accounts from his research participants and was struck by the consistency and specificity of what they described. These were not vague impressions of presence. They were detailed, particular, often bewildering encounters with something that felt, to the people experiencing it, completely and undeniably real. What are these entities? Science does not have an answer. Several possibilities exist, and we will explore them gently in a later part of our journey tonight. But for now, it is enough simply to sit with the strangeness of the fact that so many people, in so many different contexts, describe meeting something that does not match any known category of human experience, something that waits, apparently, on the other side of a molecule smaller than a grain of sand. Another experience reported across many DMT accounts, and perhaps the most difficult of all to put into words, is what researchers have come to call ego dissolution. The ego, in psychological terms, is simply the sense of being a distinct, separate self. The quiet, continuous background feeling of being you, having a name, a body, a history, a set of preferences and fears and memories that belong to you and no one else. Most of us carry this sense of self so naturally and constantly that we never notice it. It is as invisible and as omnipresent as the air. In a DMT experience, this sense of self, this invisible background of personal identity, can temporarily dissolve. The boundary between the self and everything else becomes thin, and then thinner still, and then for a time it disappears entirely. And what remains, in the accounts of people who have experienced this, is not nothing. It is something almost impossible to describe, a quality of pure awareness or pure being that is vast and spacious and without edges. Many people describe this not as frightening, though it can be at first, but as deeply restful, as a relief from the constant effort of being someone, as a return to something that was always there beneath the accumulated weight of thought and identity and daily life. And most remarkably of all, in the aftermath of these experiences, many people describe a lasting change in how they feel about the world and about themselves, a reduction in anxiety, a softening of the fear of death, a sense of connection to other people and to the natural world that persists long after the experience itself has faded. This is one of the reasons that DMT and its relatives are now being studied seriously by major universities and medical institutions around the world, not as tools for recreation, but as potential medicines for some of the deepest and most difficult forms of human suffering. Long before any laboratory had ever isolated DMT, long before any scientist had given it a name or drawn its molecular structure on a whiteboard, long before the age of neuroscience or pharmacology or peer-reviewed research, human beings had already found it in the Amazon basin, that vast, ancient, incomprehensibly biodiverse region of South America where the jungle presses close on every side and the rivers move like living things through the roots of trees. Certain indigenous cultures had, over thousands of years, developed a profound relationship with the plants that contain DMT. Through a process of knowledge and intuition that modern science still cannot fully explain, these cultures learned to combine two specific plants in a way that allowed DMT to be absorbed by the human body when drunk as a tea. The resulting brew is called ayahuasca. The word, in the Quechua language, translates roughly as vine of the soul, or sometimes vine of the dead. And for thousands of years, in the hands of trained healers called curanderos or vegetalistas, ayahuasca has been used as a tool for healing, for guidance, for connection to the ancestors and to the natural world, and to something that these traditions understand as the deeper intelligence of life itself. The ceremonies in which ayahuasca is used are careful, structured, and deeply intentional. They take place at night, usually in a specially prepared space, under the guidance of a healer who has spent years, sometimes decades, learning to work with the medicine and to navigate the experiences it produces. Songs called Icaros are sung, melodic, repetitive, ancient songs believed to guide and protect the person during their journey. The intention is always healing, always understanding, always a deepening of relationship with the self, with others, with the living world. The experiences that participants in these ceremonies describe bear remarkable similarity to the DMT experiences reported in clinical research settings. The geometric visions, the vast spaces, the entities, the dissolution of the ordinary self, the encounters with something that feels sacred or intelligent or profoundly meaningful. And the lasting effects, the reduction of depression and anxiety, the increased sense of connection and purpose, the softening of the fear of death, these too have been documented in academic research on ayahuasca participants, echoing what indigenous traditions have observed and spoken of for far longer than any scientific study has existed. The Amazon is not the only place where DMT-containing plants have played a role in human spiritual and healing traditions. Across the world and across history, human cultures have found their own relationships with the plants and fungi that alter consciousness, relationships that in many cases appear to have been central to the formation of religious and spiritual understanding. In parts of Africa, the root bark of a plant called iboga has been used for centuries in ceremonies of profound initiation, experiences described as journeys to the land of the ancestors. In North America, certain indigenous traditions have made sacred use of plants containing related compounds in ceremonies of healing and vision. In ancient Greece, some historians believe that a psychedelic preparation may have been used in the Eleusinian mysteries. Secret ceremonies that participants described as permanently changing their relationship to life and to death. The common thread across all of these traditions is not the specific plant or the specific culture. It is the intention, the care, the understanding that these experiences, when approached properly and with respect, can offer something that ordinary consciousness cannot. A glimpse, however brief and however difficult to describe, of a wider and deeper reality than the one we inhabit in our daily lives. We have talked about what DMT is and what it does and what people experience and where it has appeared in human history. Now we arrive at perhaps the most fascinating territory of all, the questions that scientists and philosophers are quietly asking about what DMT might mean. Not what it is, but what it might reveal. These are not settled questions. They are invitations. They are the kinds of questions that hover at the edge of what science currently knows and what it has not yet found a way to ask properly. We offer them not as answers, but as possibilities to turn over gently in the mind, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your hand before setting it down and letting sleep arrive. One of the earliest and most enduring theories about the natural role of DMT in the human body concerns sleep and dreaming. The idea, proposed initially by the pharmacologist and researcher Dr. Strassman and others, is that the pineal gland, a small cone-shaped structure deep in the center of the brain, may be involved in the production and release of DMT at certain critical moments. The pineal gland is already known to produce melatonin, the hormone that governs our sleep-wake cycle, that rises in response to darkness, that carries us each night from waking toward rest. And given that melatonin and DMT are chemically related, and given that the pineal gland contains many of the chemical precursors needed to produce DMT, the speculation is natural. Could the pineal gland release small amounts of DMT during deep sleep? Could DMT be involved in the production of the vivid, sometimes extraordinary imagery that characterizes our dreams? Could the strange, shifting, emotionally resonant quality of dream experience be, in some way, a softer version of what DMT produces at higher concentrations? These questions remain unanswered. There is intriguing evidence, but not yet proof. The pineal DMT hypothesis is one of the more speculative ideas in the field, and many scientists are cautious about it. But the similarity between deep dream states and DMT experiences, reported independently by so many people in so many different contexts, is a thread that researchers continue to follow with curiosity. Another possibility that scientists have explored with increasing seriousness in recent years is a connection between DMT and near-death experiences, those extraordinary accounts reported by millions of people around the world of what happens when the body comes to the edge of death and then, somehow, returns. The classic near-death experience includes several elements that will, by now, be familiar from our earlier discussion of the DMT experience. A sense of leaving the body, a movement toward or through a brilliant light, encounters with deceased relatives or with beings of extraordinary radiance and compassion, a sensation of profound peace, a peace that many describe as more complete than anything they have ever felt in ordinary life, and often a return accompanied by a lasting loss of the fear of death and a deepened sense of the preciousness of existence. The overlap with DMT accounts is striking. Dr. Strassman has proposed that at the moment of death, when the body is undergoing its final biological cascade, the brain may release a flood of DMT from its own internal stores, a last gift perhaps from the chemistry of life, a farewell that takes the form of a journey. This theory has not been proven. It may never be provable in any conventional scientific sense, but it sits alongside the clinical and spiritual evidence as one more intriguing thread in the larger tapestry of what this molecule might be doing and why it might be here. At the deepest level, the questions raised by DMT touch on what philosophers of mind call the hard problem of consciousness, the most fundamental mystery in all of science and philosophy. The hard problem, simply stated, is this: we can describe, in extraordinary detail, what the brain does. We can map its neurons and its connections and its chemical signals. We can watch in real time which regions activate when a person feels joy or fear or recognition or loss. We can correlate brain states with mental states in increasingly precise ways. And yet, for all of this, we have no explanation for why any of it feels like anything. Why is there something it is like to see blue rather than simply having a brain state that represents blue? Why does music move us? Why does love hurt? Why is consciousness the raw fact of subjective experience, of there being an inside to existence? Why does that exist at all? No one knows. This is not a gap that more data will easily fill. It is a conceptual mystery, a point at which the ordinary tools of scientific investigation seem to reach their limit. And DMT sits right at this edge. Because what DMT experiences seem to suggest, to many of the people who have them, and to some of the scientists and philosophers who study them, is that consciousness may be more fundamental, more primary, more irreducible than our current models of it allow for. If a molecule can, in 15 minutes, produce an experience that feels more real than waking life, that feels more vivid, more meaningful, more coherent, and more significant than the ordinary state of consciousness we inhabit every day, then what does that tell us about the nature of reality, about the relationship between the brain and consciousness, about whether consciousness is something the brain produces, the way a kettle produces steam, or whether consciousness is something more fundamental, something the brain receives or shapes or participates in rather than generates from nothing? These are questions without current answers, but they are questions that DMT, more than almost any other phenomenon in modern science, seems to press us urgently and gently to ask. Throughout human history, in every culture and in every era, there have been people who sought to move beyond the ordinary boundaries of consciousness. Mystics and monks and shamans and poets, people who sat for years in silence, who fasted and prayed and sang and danced until the ordinary self fell away, who walked into the desert or the forest or the cave and waited in the darkness for something to come. And what they found in that darkness, and this is one of the most quietly extraordinary facts in all of human history, is remarkably consistent across time and culture and tradition: a sense of unity, of oneness with all things, of a love so vast and so unconditional that it makes the word love seem inadequate, of a presence or an intelligence or a reality that underlies and permeates and gives rise to the world of ordinary experience, something that feels to those who encounter it more real and more fundamental than anything the senses normally perceive. DMT, for many of the people who encounter it, produces experiences that feel like they belong in this same territory, not identical to the experiences of the great mystics. Nothing is ever identical to anything else, but touching the same edges, pointing in the same direction, opening the same doors. Whether DMT is a doorway to something genuinely real, some deeper layer of existence that is ordinarily hidden from us, or whether it is simply a profound rearrangement of the brain's own processes, producing experiences that feel real but are entirely internal, this question cannot currently be resolved. But for the people who have these experiences, the distinction often feels irrelevant. What they encountered felt real. What it showed them changed them, and the direction in which it changed them toward greater compassion, greater equanimity, greater wonder, greater peace, is one that most human traditions, scientific and spiritual alike, would recognize as a movement towards something better. We return now briefly to the entities, because in the spiritual and philosophical context, these reported beings take on a particular significance that is worth sitting with. One of the most curious features of the entity encounters reported in DMT experiences is their apparent autonomy. The beings that people meet do not feel like characters in a dream. They do not feel like projections of the person's own mind. They feel, to the people experiencing them, independent, other, genuinely present in their own right, with their own intentions and their own knowledge and their own qualities that are not determined by the person encountering them. This creates a genuinely interesting philosophical problem. In science, we tend to assume that everything encountered in a mental state, however vivid, is ultimately a product of the brain that is having the state. Dreams are products of the dreamer. Visions are products of the mind that has them. There is nothing outside. But the DMT entity encounters challenge this assumption, not by proving it wrong, but simply by being so consistently and so specifically different from what ordinary dream logic would predict. They are too consistent across individuals, too specific, too surprising, They often say things or show things that the person did not expect, did not want, and could not have predicted. Some researchers have proposed that these beings may be understood as autonomous aspects of the unconscious mind, regions of the psyche that are ordinarily inaccessible, that take on dramatic forms when the usual filters of consciousness are removed. Others suggest they may be understood in terms of the deep structures of the human nervous system, ancient inherited patterns of perception and response that express themselves, under the right conditions, as apparently independent presences. And others, including some who have spent their careers studying these phenomena with rigorous scientific tools, have quietly suggested that the most honest response to the entity question may simply be openness, that we do not yet know enough about the nature of consciousness to say with confidence what it can and cannot encounter, that the universe may be stranger and more populated than our current models allow, not as belief, not as certainty, but as a quiet, honest, humble possibility. In the past decade, something remarkable has been happening in the scientific world. After a long period in which research into psychedelic substances was largely suppressed or ignored, a new generation of researchers at Johns Hopkins University, at Imperial College London, at New York University, and at institutions around the world has returned to these substances with rigorous scientific tools and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The results have been extraordinary. Studies have shown that psilocybin, a compound related to DMT found in certain mushrooms, can produce lasting reductions in depression, in treatment-resistant anxiety, in the existential distress experienced by people facing terminal illness. Studies of MDMA-assisted therapy have shown remarkable results in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the therapeutic potential of DMT and ayahuasca specifically is now being investigated at multiple research centers around the world. What these medicines seem to offer in the careful, supported, intentional context of therapeutic use is something that most conventional treatments cannot: the possibility of genuine transformation, not just symptom relief, but a fundamental shift in the person's relationship to themselves and to their experience, a loosening of rigid patterns, a reopening of possibilities that suffering had closed. Scientists who have spent their careers studying depression and trauma are using words they rarely use, words like remarkable, unprecedented, profound, not because they have abandoned their scientific rigor, but because the data itself seems to demand those words. The future of this research is not yet written. There are complex questions of safety, of access, of how these medicines can be made available responsibly and equitably, and with the proper support structures in place. There are legal and regulatory frameworks that are still catching up to the science. There are important cultural questions about how the knowledge of indigenous traditions that have worked with these medicines for centuries should be honored and respected in a modern research context. But the direction is clear, and it points quietly and consistently toward a future in which our understanding of consciousness and our ability to help human beings heal from the deepest forms of suffering may be very different from what it is today. We began with a molecule, small enough to hold in imagination between the thumb and finger, small enough to balance on the tip of a thought, and we followed it into the jungle, into the laboratory, into the vast geometry of the inner world, into the arms of entities made of light, into the questions at the very edge of what human minds can currently conceive. And now we return, slowly, the way a dream returns you to the waking world, gently, without announcement, with one reality dissolving into another so softly that you cannot quite say where the transition happened. DMT remains, in the end, a mystery, a beautiful and profound and humbling mystery. It is there in the plants, in the soil, in the ancient traditions, in the laboratories, in the accounts of millions of people across thousands of years. It is perhaps there in the chemistry of your own dreaming mind right now, as sleep approaches. What it means, what it is truly for, what it truly shows us, what the entities are, what the realms are, what the profound and consistent sense of meaning and recognition and homecoming that people report in its presence is pointing toward. These questions remain open, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps the deepest truths are not the ones we can capture and label and file away. Perhaps they are the ones that live in the questions themselves, in the wide, humble, curious space of not knowing, in the willingness to sit at the edge of the mystery and simply be present to it without demanding that it resolve. The human mind is vast. This we know. It contains within its ordinary borders more complexity than any other known structure in the universe, and DMT, this tiny, ancient, endlessly strange molecule, seems to suggest that even those vast borders are not the whole story, that beyond them, or beneath them, or woven into the very fabric of what we are, there is something more. Rest now. Let all of these thoughts drift slowly, like leaves on a dark river, moving without urgency towards some distant and peaceful shore. You do not need to hold them. You do not need to understand them tonight. The mystery does not go anywhere. I hope you to read to you again. Good night.